So this is a difficult text because in its original context, the original words really here refer to relationships between masters and slaves. The ESV translates this as bondservants, and it takes away a little bit of the oomph. But the original word could just as easily be translated as slave. And so this immediately becomes a bit of a dicey topic. And to explain a little bit of the original context and the dynamics that were in place then and the differences between then and now would take up at least an hour or so before we even got to the nitty-gritty of the text. So you're going to forgive me, I'm going to just sort of skip past that. But I just want to say a few key things, recognizing that obviously the idea of slavery, the term slavery, is deeply connected to the history of the United States and sort of brings up all sorts of thoughts and feelings, understandably so, and we just don't have the time to get into it. I'm very happy if someone wants to go deeper on this, and if your curiosity is piqued by this, I'm very happy to maybe speak to you about it during the week at some point, and we can go into greater depth. But I just want to say a few key things before we go into the passage and think about how it can apply to us. I think, and I hope that no one here is a slave, and so maybe we don't have the direct experience of what it means to be in a slave-master relationship. I certainly hope that you don't. And I'm not being entirely facetious because there is modern-day slavery, but I do want us to think about an analogous dynamic that we might have, which is our work dynamics as employees, employers, and our understanding of how the gospel impacts our work relationships. So I'm just going to say a few things. In your outline, there's a little introduction to slavery in the New Testament, just very, very briefly, okay? One is, we have to understand that we can't look at passages like this and imagine ourselves, and imagine Paul speaking into a context that's like our 21st century, modern, highly, capitalistic, democratic society, and just imagine Paul speaking into a similar context. It was radically different. Okay, we're talking about first century Mediterranean culture, Roman Empire. Okay, very different from what we've ever experienced. And in that society, as with basically all societies of the time, no matter where you went in the globe, slavery was just a part of the social fabric. Doesn't make it right. It's just that was the reality, okay? Pick a point of the globe in the first century, slavery was going on, okay? And so it was a key part of the social fabric of the Roman Empire. There were many cities in the Roman Empire where the slave population vastly outnumbered the free population. Sometimes 2 to 1, more slaves than what you call free people who were not in that slave relationship. And most of the slavery was not what we might think of when we think about the North American historical context of the transatlantic slave trade. We're not talking about the Roman Empire going into nations and taking entire tribes or people groups and then selling them as slaves. Most of this was sort of one-to-one debt slavery. I got into debt with someone. I didn't have a way to pay it back. The way that I paid it back was I went into basically a form of indentured servanthood to that person until, through a process of work, I could be released. I could become free again, right? Basically, however they determined the debt to work ratio and how that worked out, how much my money was worth in terms of days, months, and years of work. When I was done, I could be released. I could be set free. So I don't want you to imagine a whole slave industry the way that you had in North America. Most of it was that sort of dynamic. It was a way of dealing with debt, okay? Still, we can read this and say, why didn't Paul write a letter and say, slaves, rebel against your masters, let's take down the slave structure and system, this is evil, and let's destroy it, okay? We might react that way. Well, first, we need to remember, again, it's not the 21st century North America. Christianity in the Roman Empire was a tiny, especially in the first century, tiny, did I mention tiny, minority in a culture that was completely indifferent and ignorant of the existence of Christians, basically, and that was at best hostile to Christians at worst. It's a little bit like imagining Christians in Iran, right? So a small Christian community in Iran, or maybe in a more extreme case in North Korea, upset about a social injustice, right? It's like, that's great. What are you going to do? You know, you can rail against the empire and slave system, and the empire is just going to squash you under the thumb. There really is. Christians had none of the social clout and influence and power that they would have later in medieval times and into recent European history. That's not the context of the first century. In the first century, tiny minority, at best a nuisance to the authorities, at worst perceived as a threat and needed to be destroyed. And so Paul, had he railed against slavery, wouldn't have gotten anywhere. And there's an argument to say that if, in fact, all the slaves that had been addressed by Paul had usurped the authority, they would have actually ended up worse than when they began, i.e., just murdered, killed, and that was the end of it. In other words, if he had written to these slaves and said, slaves in Ephesus, rise up against your masters, they probably would have ended up dead, and most of the Christians kicked out in the first place. So that's a little bit of the situation that Paul is writing to. But here's something that we need to keep in mind. Just because Paul is writing to people who are in a slave-master relationship and not telling them to rise up and rebel, but telling them how they can bring the gospel into that situation and how they can seek to bring kind of some of the redemptive aspects of Christianity into that situation, doesn't mean that Paul is endorsing slavery. It means that Paul is being a Christian, but also a realist and a pragmatist, right? Tragically, it is true that many Christians in this country and others use this sort of passage to justify and defend slavery, including many Presbyterians, to our shame. Okay? It's true. But we have to remember, just because Paul is finding a way, how can a Christian in a slave-master dynamic live out his Christian faith, doesn't mean that Paul is endorsing slavery. He's just recognizing it's a reality, and let's see how we can work with it. Okay? The one encouraging thing is many Christians also use passages like these and others to speak against slavery and ultimately lead the movement against slavery. It's interesting, as an aside, we're Presbyterians, we're connected historically to a figure like John Calvin. John Calvin, writing in the 1500s, 300 years before the end of slavery in North America, from passages like this, and you can go find this, you can Google this because it's all public domain, spoke strongly against slavery. 300 years before slavery ended in North America, John Calvin, sort of the theological leader of the movement that would end up being Presbyterianism, strongly speaking against slavery. So Christians very early on recognized that slavery was a very, very evil and deplorable practice. Now, what do we do in our context? We have the joy and privilege of not being in slave-master relationships. I think what we see in passages like this is principles that I think we can apply to thinking about how we are to bring the gospel into relationships of authority. For example, in this case, perhaps work. Our employers are not our masters, and if we are workers, employees, we're not slaves, though we may sometimes feel that way or something, but the principles are still true. In these relational dynamics, how can the gospel work and serve as a way of blessing and flourishing? So I want us to think, and Christians have recently thought about this, that there's a lot here that can teach us about the relationship between workers and their employers, right? Employers and employees. And that's sort of the analogy I want to draw. I do want to say, passages like this need to remind us that there are more slaves in the world now than there ever have been in history. And we do need to be praying for slavery, even in North America, thinking especially of the sex trade and children in the sex trade. So let's think a little bit about what it could mean to be a worker who brings the gospel into his workplace, his or her workplace, to be a spirit-filled worker. Paul begins here with a command. The command is the what. What are we to do? If we're Christians and we're in a place where we're working, what are we to do? That's the question I want us to start with. Okay? The command is obey your masters, obey your employees. In other words, Paul's saying do what your boss asks you to do. Okay? Of course, always, as always, as with the previous exceptions, the implication is do whatever they ask you to do unless what they ask you to do violates God's law. Okay, of course, that's the line you can't cross. If your employer asks you to do something that makes you go against God's law, or asks you to not do something that would imply disobeying God's law, you don't do that. You are there in those sorts of situations called to disobedience. There are times where disobedience is obedience to God. Disobedience to people is obedience to God, or obedience to God will require you to disobey people. But outside of that, Paul's basically saying, look, your boss is asking you to do something, do it. Don't complain, don't grumble, don't resist, don't do something different. Do it, okay? That's straightforward, but the question is how? How should I do it, and what should drive me and motivate me? And so Paul says 3 times, and this is in your outline, he says 3 times, work for Jesus. Whatever you're doing, whether you're working at a gas station, whether you're an engineer, an architect, a lawyer, whatever sphere of reality you're in, if you have someone over you who's asking you to do things, do it, work for them, but really work for Jesus. He says it 3 times. Verse 5, obey your earthly masters as you would Christ. Verse 6, obey as bondservants to Christ. Verse 7, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. As to the Lord and not to man. In other words, above anything else, whether or not your boss deserves it, work for him as if you were working directly for Jesus. Okay? Put in the effort as if Jesus was your boss, because what Paul is saying is essentially, he is. Okay? Jesus' authority, in a sense, is being mediated through your boss. So obey him with the same effort, the same attitude as you would if Jesus himself was asking you to do that. Okay? Conversely, though, so work for Jesus. Do what you do, your effort, your energy, your attitude, your willingness. Do it as if you're working for Jesus, because in a very real sense, he is your ultimate boss, right? But the other side of that coin is, don't do it for people's accolades. Verse 6, not by way of eye service as people pleasers. Verse 7, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. Okay? That's important. He's not saying it's wrong to receive and to enjoy attaboys when you're working. That's perfectly okay. If someone is congratulating you for a job well done, receive it, and receive it as the Lord giving you an attaboy through the person. So there's nothing wrong with enjoying that. There's nothing wrong with taking a promotion, accepting a promotion and being successful at work. Absolutely not. I would argue the ordinary pattern will be, if you work in your place of work, if you work as unto the Lord, you probably will be promoted, because you will be a diligent, hard worker with a good attitude, who's faithful, who's trustworthy, who's reliable, and so on. And so if those opportunities open up, and there's no violation of God's commands in taking those promotions, you're not going to be doing anything that goes against God's will or your conscience, embrace it, take it, enjoy it, be blessed. That's absolutely fine. But what Paul is saying is, don't do it so as to receive those attaboys. Don't do it, don't let your primary driver be those promotions. Don't let your primary driver be that people would see you and be so impressed with what a good worker you are. That's Paul's point. Do it so that you please Jesus. Do it unto the Lord. And if you get these other things as, extras, as a result of doing so, that's great. Have at it. And Paul kind of reaffirms that by twice saying, and do so with sincerity, do so from the heart. Verse 5, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart. Paul uses that term, fear and trembling, a lot. He doesn't mean that you're literally supposed to go through life freaked out and nervous and anxious. His point is, take it seriously. Okay? Take this seriously. And do it with a sincere heart. He reiterates it again in verse 6, doing the will of God from the heart. If you obey your master, you're doing the will of God. Oh, what's God's will for my life? Be a good employee. That's God's will for your life. It's not very sexy, it's not very dramatic, but it's what the Lord's asking from you. Okay? And do it for real. Don't do it like, wow, Sam told me on Sunday about it, have a good attitude. No. Paul says, mean it. Actually mean it from the heart. Do your work with sincerity. Do it for Jesus, not for the attaboys, not for other people to see you be such a great employee. Do it for real, from the heart. Be sincere, out of genuine love and affection. And you have letters A, B, and C here. I've got a curveball for you. You've got to add a D there. Okay? Why? What is obey your masters? How? Do it for Jesus. Don't do it for men. Do it with sincerity. Why? Look at verse 8. Knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he's a bondservant or is free. So D is work for the promise. Work for the promise. There's a promise here. Like there was a promise for children who obey their parents that it may go well with you in the land, that you may have blessing. Paul adds, you will receive a reward from the Lord. Now, I don't know, because Paul doesn't go into any detail, I don't know if this is a reward in this world or the world to come or both. I don't know if he means there will be a general spiritual blessing or some sort of concrete material blessing. Maybe it's all of the above, maybe it's different variances. But whatever it looks like, Paul is telling you, if you work for the Lord, not for people, with sincerity of the heart, Jesus himself is going to reward you in some way. The Bible has no problem motivating us with reward, by the way. You know, we kind of are more spiritual than the Bible sometimes. Oh, the only thing that matters is that Jesus sees, and I don't have to receive anything back. Jesus has no problem rewarding you. He has no problem rewarding you. He has no problem extending you, giving you a motivation and saying that he will bless you. A lot of people say he was going to bless you with material prosperity, a great house, you know, BMW or something. I don't know. I don't know if that's what the blessing looks like. But you will experience his blessings in some way. You will experience blessing. But Paul's saying, if your boss never rewards you, never recognizes your work, doesn't treat you that well, still work for him as if you would work for Jesus. Do so with the best of attitudes and sincerity. And do so awaiting Jesus' attaboys, Jesus' pleasure, and Jesus' reward. That's what Paul is saying. That's how you should work. And that's a sign of an employee filled with the Holy Spirit. Because we're still on that theme of being filled with the Holy Spirit. One way or another, Jesus will do it. And you know what that means? What Paul is really doing is, in light of the gospel, everything about our life gets shaped by faith. In other words, when you're a son or daughter that's obeying your parents, you don't obey parents, but you do so, and you do so because you love Jesus and because you believe that there will be blessing in so doing, you're walking by faith. You're trusting that God has given you a promise that he will bless you, and you're trusting that he will bless you and that he will help you through that. And same thing here. You're trusting God. I don't see what the reward is of obeying this boss. He's a pain. He's unkind, he's unfair, but I'm going to do so, and I'm going to do so sincerely from the heart with a good attitude, and I'm going to trust that in this there is blessing, even if I can't see it right now. That's a life of faith. It's living by faith. Now you might be thinking, that's really good theology, but this all seems so mundane and so boring. Sam, give me something interesting. You're just basically telling me to be a good employee. That's not very interesting. Well, I've told this story before, you probably have heard it, but I wouldn't be here today if someone hadn't taken these commands seriously. If someone hadn't taken those promises seriously. I literally wouldn't exist, and I wouldn't be a Christian if someone hadn't taken it seriously. I've told this story before, but my dad, when he was in his early to mid-20s, basically ran his father's hardware store, because my grandfather had suffered a series of heart attacks and was not doing well in terms of his health. And so my dad was in his early 20s, basically running a hardware store, making really good money, and my dad was an avowed atheist. Like, not just, I don't know if there's a God out there, like, there is no God. There is no God, right? And there was a man in his nearing retirement age, certainly in his 60s, who worked for my dad, who was an employee in the hardware store. And he was an enthusiastic, born-again, Pentecostal Christian. And he showed up at work every day with a smile on his face, ready to serve, ready to help. And this drove my dad crazy. It drove my dad crazy because here's this uneducated older man nearing retirement, very poor. He's my employee. And he shows up and he's always happy and he's always willing to serve and work. And my dad gave him no compliments, didn't make his life any easier, made fun of his faith and religion to his face. And this employee kept showing up every day, smile on his face, humility, work, and service. And this drove my dad crazy. Until one day my dad was observing all this, and he realized, this guy has something that I don't. I can't deny it. I'm a third of his age. I had made 3 or 4 times his money. I've got my whole life ahead of me. I've got my health. And yet he has something that I do not. And that started a chain reaction. It was the first domino in a domino effect that ended up with my dad talking to a missionary that was in Chile at the time, coming to faith in Christ. And through coming to faith in Christ, meeting my mom, and here I am. I don't know what sort of rewards the gentleman that worked for my dad, what kind of rewards he experienced from the hands of the Lord. But I'll tell you one thing. One reward he definitely experienced is to see his boss come to Christ. And I suspect that man found that reward enough. So, instructions about work, it can make the difference between life and death, someone existing or not, someone meeting Christ or not. It can mean the universe to someone. We wouldn't be here talking about this if it wasn't for this old Pentecostal guy in the 70s in Chile. Isn't that an interesting thing to think about? And I suspect a lot of our stories have little moments and stories like this. God's great plan of redemption for the world actually plays out in these thousands and millions of little stories where simple behavior, simple attitude, the way that you work, the way that you relate to a neighbor, the way that you talk to someone can just radically change someone's life. So be encouraged. Sorry, and that last point here, briefly. What does the Spirit-filled employer look like? And it's only one verse, verse 9. But there's a command here. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven. This may not seem radical to us. In the first century Roman Empire, this was radical. Really radical. I mean, in the Roman Empire, if you had a slave, and by the way, a slave could be a doctor, could be a lawyer, could be someone that was erudite and educated, but weren't that, and so they could become your slave. You could treat a slave however you wanted. You could kill your slave, and there was no legal penalty for doing so. And no one would tell you what to do with your slave. That was your business. And Paul is talking to the master and says, stop threatening them. Stop ill-treating them. Paul says, yeah, you can do whatever you want to your slave if you want, according to Roman law, according to Roman culture. But if you've become a Christian, that needs to change. And the way you relate to them needs to change. And hopefully no one here is a slave master, but if you are an employer, if you are a boss in any capacity, the question is, how are you treating your employees? Paul basically says 2 things, and there are 2 sides of the same coin. One is, treat workers the way Jesus treats you. Paul reminds the masters, you may be the master of this guy in this situation, but both he and you, or she and you, have a master in common, have a boss in common. You may be the boss of that guy, that gal, but the 2 of you have a boss in common, and that's Jesus. You work for him, ultimately, right? There is someone over you. And think about how Jesus treats you. Does Jesus threaten you? Does Jesus crush you or beat you or any of these things? The answer is obvious. Of course not. Jesus is so kind and graceful and servant-hearted. We know from the Gospels, he leans down, he stoops down and washes the feet of his disciples. That's how Jesus leads. That's how Jesus is the boss. And Paul is saying, remember the way Jesus is your master, your Lord, your boss, and the way that he treats you. And that is the way you should be treating those under you. So if you're an employer, if you're a boss in any space, if you're leading a company or a corporation or whatever it may be, a ministry, does the way that you relate to those who work under you look like Jesus in the way he relates to you? But the second thing is, Paul highlights, you are, if you're in this sort of position of authority, you are accountable to treat workers aware that Jesus holds you accountable. So let's look at verse 9 again. Stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, Jesus, and that there is no partiality with him. That last line would likely have made the masters who heard this gulp. Paul is basically saying, whatever the structures of power might be in Roman society, before Jesus, you and he, you and this person, are exactly the same. And when he comes to judge, because the language of partiality speaks of Jesus' judgment, he will show no partiality. He's not going to favor you because you were a master, because you were a boss, because you were an employer. He's going to hold you accountable for the way in which you exercised that power. Or we might say now, the way that you exercise that leadership. You are accountable. You might be over some people, but you've got one who is over you, to whom you will be accountable. Now, the question is, how do we make sense of this, right? In a modern capitalist society, if you're running a business, if you're running a corporation or an NGO or a ministry or whatever it might look like, a church, whatever it is, what does it look like? It doesn't mean, for example, that you can't fire someone. If someone is, their behavior or their performance is just not where it should be, you may have to do that, okay? The question is whether you're promoting someone, encouraging someone, challenging someone, or firing someone, whatever it might look like, is your attitude, is your behavior one that reflects Christ? Do you look like Christ as you're doing so? In all of this, we remember none of us can do any of this perfectly. And if you've ever been an employer or an employee, I'm sure that when you think carefully and meditate carefully on these passages, you can think of ways in which you have failed. But the gospel brings us grace, and the gospel challenges us. No matter how many times we have failed, no matter how many times we will fail, the Lord invites us to come to him, to receive grace and power and strength, to grow and become more like him over time, even if it's a process. And that's why we come to the table. We come to the table not because we deserve to receive something from the Lord, not because we've done so great that we get an attaboy from the Lord by coming to the table. We come to this table because we know that we have fallen. We come to the table because we know we need his help. We need his mercy and his grace. So the table is not for those who have figured it all out. The table is not for the sinlessly perfect. It's for those of us who know we are sinners, we need his grace, and that we want to become more like his son.